At 8:17 on a cold November morning in Chicago, Margaret Holloway received an estimate that contained 4 words she could not stop looking at. $200,000 recommended repair, 8 Bentley Bentayga speed vehicles, 8 identical fault patterns, 8 identical repair recommendations, $25,000 per vehicle. The numbers sat on the page with the calm certainty of something that expected immediate approval. Most people would have signed. Margaret did not. The resulting voltage drop was small enough to escape normal detection, yet large enough to disrupt every advanced driver assistance module sharing the same power rail. The outcome looked catastrophic. Multiple systems failed simultaneously: cameras, radar, stability systems, emergency braking. Everything appeared broken. In reality, none of those expensive components had failed at all. The problem was a $14 fuse. Ryan had documented everything: voltage logs, thermal measurements, manufacturer guidance. He submitted the report to his department director, Jason Mercer, with a recommendation that F-47 be added to every relevant service inspection. Jason's response arrived 48 hours later: not applicable to current inventory. Do not escalate. 3 months afterward, Ryan was terminated. Official reason: lack of team cohesion. He had printed both emails before leaving and stored them in a manila folder, not because he expected to need them someday, because some documents deserved to survive. Ryan returned to the present and told Margaret he would inspect the first vehicle personally. By noon, a silver Bentley Bentayga arrived on a flatbed truck. Lucas connected the scan tool. 14 active fault codes appeared instantly, exactly as Margaret had described. Most technicians would have focused on the expensive modules generating the warnings. Ryan focused on the pattern. Every affected system shared the same electrical supply rail. That detail mattered. He explained it to Lucas while reviewing the scan results. The modules aren't failing, Ryan said. They're reporting accurately that the power reaching them isn't stable. Lucas frowned. So the components are working? The components are doing exactly what they're supposed to do. Ryan moved toward the rear junction panel beneath the cargo floor. He connected a multimeter and thermal probe. At ambient temperature, everything appeared normal. The fuse tested within specification. That was what made the defect dangerous. It hid until the vehicle reached operating temperature. Ryan started the engine and watched the readings carefully. As heat increased, voltage began dropping. Slowly, almost invisibly. At 160 degrees, the reading remained acceptable. At 175 degrees, it slipped lower. At 182 degrees, it crossed the threshold. Lucas stared at the display. That's it? Ryan nodded. That's it. The voltage difference measured only fractions of a volt. On most vehicles, it would have meant nothing. On the Bentayga's advanced driver assistance platform, it meant everything. The system no longer trusted the information coming from its sensors, not because the sensors were broken, because the electricity feeding them had become unreliable. Ryan removed fuse F-47. Visually, it looked perfect. No burn marks, no obvious damage. That was the nature of thermal degradation. The failure happened internally, hidden beneath an intact exterior. 5 minutes later, he installed a new $14 fuse. He cleared the codes, restarted the engine, waited for operating temperature. The voltage remained stable. Every warning disappeared. He completed multiple road tests, logged temperatures, recorded voltages, documented scan results, and compiled every measurement into a detailed report. By late afternoon, the Bentley was operating perfectly. Total repair cost, $14. Ryan knew the real fight was only beginning. Margaret Holloway arrived at Cole Auto Repair at 7:05 the next morning, carrying a leather portfolio and the kind of expression people wore when they were preparing for a difficult conversation. Snow drifted past the front windows, while traffic crawled along Halsted Street outside. Inside the shop, Grace sat at a small folding table coloring pictures of race cars. She looked up when Margaret entered. "Hi." "Hello." Grace held up a crayon, drawing proudly. "This one's fast." Margaret smiled despite herself. "It certainly looks fast." Ryan emerged from the service bay carrying a binder thick enough to qualify as a textbook. Without ceremony, he placed it on the counter. Everything's in there. Margaret opened the binder. Diagnostic logs, voltage measurements, thermal readings, photographs, Bentley Technical Bulletin TB2 023441, manufacturer documentation, road test results, every page organized and indexed. Margaret Holloway had built Morrison Capital Group from a two-person investment office into one of the most respected private firms in the Midwest. She had spent 3 decades evaluating risk, spotting inconsistencies, and understanding that when 8 supposedly independent failures appeared at the exact same time, coincidence was rarely the correct explanation. Something about the estimate bothered her. She flipped through the report for nearly 10 minutes before finally looking up. "You fixed it, with a $14 fuse. Technically $13.92, and Vance Prestige wanted $200,000. Ryan shrugged. The estimate was based on replacing multiple modules. That weren't broken. Correct. Margaret stared at him. Do you understand what this means? Ryan nodded. Probably. Humor me. Either someone didn't know about the bulletin, he paused, or someone did. Silence settled between them. Margaret closed the binder slowly. She had spent enough years in finance to understand the difference between incompetence and intent. Incompetence created random mistakes. Intent created patterns. 8 identical vehicles, 8 identical diagnoses, 8 identical estimates. That looked very much like a pattern. I'd like to inspect the other 7, Ryan said. Without telling the dealership first. Margaret nodded immediately. Done. By Thursday afternoon, all 8 Bentleys had passed through Cole Auto Repair. Every single one displayed the exact same failure. Every single one required the exact same $14 fuse. Every single one returned to perfect operation afterward. Total parts cost, $111.36. Total amount originally quoted by Vance Prestige, $200,000. Lucas stared at the final spreadsheet. That's insane. Ryan leaned back in his chair. No. Insane is when somebody does something irrational. He tapped the report. This looks organized. Lucas didn't like the sound of that. Neither did Margaret. The following Monday, Margaret requested a private meeting with Isabella Vance, the newly appointed CEO of Vance Prestige Auto Group. Isabella agreed immediately. At 37, she had spent less than 6 months in the role after replacing her father, Edward Vance, who had retired unexpectedly following a health scare. Unlike many second-generation executives, Isabella had spent years working throughout the company before reaching the executive office. She knew the service department. She knew warranty operations. She knew how dealerships actually worked, which was exactly why Margaret chose not to send lawyers first. She wanted to see Isabella's reaction. The meeting began at 10:00 a.m. inside a glass-walled conference room overlooking downtown Chicago. Isabella expected a discussion about fleet management contracts. Instead, Margaret placed Ryan's binder on the table. You have a problem. Isabella opened the report. 15 minutes later, she was no longer reading casually. 20 minutes later, she was taking notes. 30 minutes later, she looked genuinely disturbed. Who prepared this? Ryan Cole. Isabella froze. Ryan Cole? You know him? Isabella sat back slowly. Everyone in technical operations knew him. Margaret waited. He solved problems nobody else could solve. Isabella's eyes remained fixed on the report. Then he disappeared. He was fired. I know. Her voice had changed slightly. I was vice president of regional operations at the time. Margaret noticed something then. Something subtle. Isabella wasn't surprised by Ryan's findings. She was surprised by Ryan's name. What aren't you telling me? Margaret asked quietly. Isabella closed the binder. 3 years ago, Ryan submitted a recommendation involving Bentley Technical Bulletin TB 2023441, the fuse bulletin. Isabella nodded. I approved implementation. Margaret frowned. Then why wasn't it implemented? Isabella's expression hardened. That's an excellent question. 2 hours later, Isabella was sitting alone in her office reviewing archived internal communications. Most executives delegated that sort of work. Isabella never had. She preferred original documents. At 1:40, 3 p.m. She found the email. Ryan's report. Detailed, accurate, complete. Attached beneath it sat Isabella's approval notice authorizing inspection updates across the Bentley division. Then came the final message. From Jason Mercer, Service Operations Director. Subject. Resolution. Implementation deemed unnecessary. Recommendation withdrawn after technical review. Isabella stared at the screen. There had been no technical review, no review board, no supporting documentation, just Jason. She opened another file, then another, then another. Over the next 3 hours, a pattern emerged. Customer complaints, repeated module replacements, escalated repair estimates, technical recommendations quietly closed, bulletin references removed from service summaries. Individually, none of the cases attracted attention. Together, they painted a very different picture. At 5:12 p.m., Isabella called internal audit. At 5:14, she called legal counsel. At 5:17, all 8 vehicles had entered Vance Prestige Auto Group during the same week for routine maintenance. All 8 had been returned with clean inspections, and all 8 had begun displaying the same cluster of critical warning messages within 14 days. The pattern was too neat, too symmetrical, too convenient. Instead of signing, she picked up the phone and called a man whose name she had heard months earlier during an unrelated conversation. Ryan Cole. She instructed IT to preserve every communication associated with Jason Mercer's department dating back 4 years. By 5:30, Jason had no idea his career was already collapsing around him. Meanwhile, across town, Ryan was helping Grace build a cardboard castle at the kitchen table. The apartment smelled faintly of grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup. Grace carefully positioned a paper flag on one of the towers. It needs a garage. A garage? For race cars. Ryan nodded. Obviously. Grace looked pleased that he understood. His phone buzzed. Unknown number. Ryan almost ignored it. Almost. Instead, he answered, Ryan Cole. A brief pause followed. Then a woman's voice spoke calmly. Mr. Cole, this is Isabella Vance. Ryan didn't say anything. He simply leaned back in his chair and listened, because after 3 years of silence, some conversations were worth hearing all the way through. Isabella Vance did not begin the conversation with an apology. Ryan noticed that immediately. Most executives would have. Most would have spent the first 5 minutes explaining why something wasn't their fault. Isabella skipped all of that. I reviewed the Bentley bulletin case. Ryan remained silent. You were right. Another pause. I know. To her credit, she didn't seem offended by the response. I also reviewed several hundred related service records. And I think the Bentley issue is much larger than 8 vehicles. Ryan leaned back in his chair while Grace continued building cardboard towers beside him. How much larger? I don't know yet. That answer, more than anything else, convinced Ryan she was being honest. People who lied always seemed to have exact numbers. What do you need from me? Isabella asked. Ryan looked at Grace, carefully balancing a paper drawbridge between 2 castle walls. Nothing. Nothing? You have internal audit, legal counsel, it. And you have experience, Ryan smiled faintly. Experience got me fired. Silence settled over the line. Finally, Isabella spoke. Would you at least meet with me? Ryan considered the question for several seconds. Tomorrow, 7 a.m. Where? Cole Auto Repair. You're making the CEO come to you? Grace suddenly looked up. Tell her we have donuts. Ryan covered the phone. We don't have donuts. We can. Isabella actually laughed. It surprised both of them. 7 a.m., she said, and I'll bring donuts. The next morning, she arrived carrying 2 boxes from a bakery 3 blocks away. Lucas nearly dropped a wrench when he recognized her. Ryan accepted a coffee without comment and led Isabella into the small office behind the service bays. She looked around carefully. No marble floors, no glass conference rooms, no executive assistants, just shelves filled with service manuals, diagnostic binders, and handwritten notes accumulated over years of solving problems. You kept everything. Ryan followed her gaze. Most people throw away information. You don't. Information ages better than opinions. Isabella nodded slowly. Then she opened a folder. We found 23 similar cases so far. Ryan took the folder. Audi, Bentley, Porsche, Mercedes, Maybach, different vehicles, different customers. Same pattern. Technical bulletins ignored. Expensive repairs recommended. Simpler solutions never disclosed. 23, Ryan repeated. That's just the first pass. Isabella looked exhausted. Internal audit thinks there may be hundreds. Lucas, listening from the doorway, nearly choked on his coffee. Hundreds? Isabella nodded. Maybe more. Ryan flipped through the records. The details changed. The strategy did not. Every case involved information customers never received. Every case increased revenue. Every case benefited service operations. Jason built a system, Ryan said quietly. Isabella looked up immediately. That's exactly what audit said. INOMID. End of, and, to, end of, every, to. Systems are harder to notice than theft. Why? Because people expect theft to look dramatic. Ryan closed the folder. Most corruption looks like policy. That sentence stayed with Isabella long after the meeting ended. By Thursday, forensic auditors had expanded the investigation across multiple dealership locations. By Friday, legal counsel discovered something worse. The ignored technical bulletins were not random. Certain repairs generated extraordinarily high profit margins. Internal communications suggested managers were quietly encouraged to prioritize those repairs whenever possible. No memo explicitly ordered fraud. No document contained obvious criminal instructions. The system had been designed carefully. Plausible deniability at every level. Yet the pattern remained impossible to ignore. Meanwhile, a former dealership diagnostic specialist who now operated a small independent repair shop on Chicago's Halsted Street. At that exact moment, Ryan was unlocking the side entrance to Cole Auto Repair. He arrived every morning at 6:45, regardless of weather. The routine never changed. Unlock the door, switch on the overhead lights, turn up the aging wall heater, wait for it to complain loudly before finally producing warmth. News of the Bentley repairs had begun circulating among fleet managers throughout Illinois. Customers started calling. Questions started spreading. Service records were requested. Independent inspections were ordered. For the first time in years, Vance Prestige found itself explaining decisions instead of making them. Late Friday afternoon, Isabella received the call she had been expecting. Jason Mercer, I hear there's an audit. There is. You should have spoken with me first. Isabella looked out the window of her office. Why? Because some of those findings can be misinterpreted. Can they? Jason hesitated. You're making a mistake. Isabella ended the call without answering. 20 minutes later, legal counsel informed her that Jason had attempted to access archived records outside his authorization level. The request was denied automatically. At 6:03 p.m., his system access was suspended. At 6:07 p.m., security escorted him from headquarters. Across town, Ryan knew none of this. He was busy helping Grace practice spelling words at the kitchen table. Mechanic. Grace read carefully. Correct. Transmission. Correct. She grinned. Ferrari. Ryan laughed. That's not on the list. Still spelled it right. Fair point. His phone buzzed again. This time the caller ID displayed Isabella's name. Ryan answered. Good evening. Jason's gone. Ryan looked out the apartment window into the falling snow. For a moment, neither spoke. 3 years earlier, that news would have meant everything to him. Now it felt strangely distant. Ryan? Isabella asked. Yeah? Aren't you going to say something? He thought about it. About the termination. The humiliation. The years spent rebuilding a life from scratch. Then he looked at Grace, proudly writing the word Ferrari across her notebook. Not really. Why not? Ryan smiled. Because I already got the important part back. Isabella didn't understand immediately. Then she heard Grace laughing in the background. And suddenly she did. The story should have ended there. At least that's what most people would assume. The dishonest executive was gone. The audit was expanding. The truth was finally coming to light. But reality rarely follows the structure people expect. Problems that take years to build do not disappear in a single week. The following Monday, Vance Prestige received its first formal legal demand from a fleet management company requesting reimbursement for unnecessary repairs dating back almost 4 years. By Wednesday, 3 more arrived. By Friday, there were 12. Every request contained the same phrase, failure to disclose available technical guidance. Isabella spent most of that week in conference rooms with attorneys, auditors, and compliance specialists. The deeper they looked, the more complicated the situation became, not because the fraud itself was difficult to understand, because it had become embedded in the culture. Employees had learned which questions not to ask. Managers had learned which reports disappeared if they pushed too hard. Technicians had learned that identifying inexpensive solutions often generated less praise than recommending expensive ones. Nobody had created the problem alone, but everyone had helped it survive. Late Thursday evening, Isabella sat alone in her office reviewing another audit summary when a name appeared repeatedly throughout the documentation: Ryan Cole. Not because he had caused problems, because he had reported them, again, and again, and again. Over a span of 4 years, Ryan had submitted technical recommendations, process improvements, customer protection proposals, and escalation reports. Some had been ignored, others had been altered, a few had simply vanished. Isabella leaned back slowly. The company had spent years treating one of its most valuable employees as a problem because he refused to become convenient. The realization made her uncomfortable. It was supposed to. Across town, life remained considerably simpler. Ryan was replacing brake components on an aging Honda Accord while Lucas organized parts deliveries. Grace sat at the front counter doing homework. Around noon, a black SUV stopped outside the shop. Then another. Lucas looked through the window. Ryan? What? Either we're getting very important customers or we're being raided. Ryan glanced up. Probably customers. The front door opened. 3 people entered wearing tailored suits. The shop occupied a narrow space, squeezed between a Vietnamese grocery store and a dry cleaner. Most people walked past it without noticing. Inside, however, everything reflected a different story. Tools were arranged with military precision. Diagnostic cables were coiled neatly. Every wrench, socket, and scanner had a designated place. Ryan believed that organization was a form of honesty. The equipment should tell customers everything they needed to know before a single word was spoken. The woman in front introduced herself immediately. Sandra Whitmore, General Counsel, Vance Prestige. Lucas nearly dropped a box of filters. Ryan wiped his hands and walked over calmly. How can I help you? Sandra placed a thick folder on the counter. Our board would like to make an offer. Ryan didn't touch the folder. All right. Director of Technical Integrity. Lucas blinked twice. Grace looked up from her homework. That sounds fancy. Nobody disagreed. Sandra continued. Full authority over diagnostic standards, technical training, customer disclosure policies, and manufacturer bulletin implementation. Ryan finally opened the folder. The compensation package was substantial. The authority even more so. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Grace raised her hand. Question. Sandra smiled politely. Yes? Will my dad still pick me up from school? The room fell completely silent. Ryan looked at the ceiling. Sandra looked at Isabella's written proposal, then back at Grace. I honestly don't know. Grace nodded seriously. Then you should probably figure that out first. Lucas turned away because he was trying not to laugh. Sandra, to her credit, laughed openly. That seems reasonable. After they left, Ryan carried the folder into the office and sat down. He stared at it for a long time. The offer represented everything he once thought he wanted. Respect. Influence. The ability to prevent exactly the kind of misconduct that had destroyed his career. Yet something held him back. Around 6 that evening, there was a knock at the office door. Grace stepped inside carrying a juice box. You're thinking. I am. Big thinking or little thinking? Ryan smiled. Probably big thinking. She climbed into the chair across from him. Want help? Always. Grace pointed at the folder. You want to know if you should go. Something like that. She considered this carefully. Do they need you? Ryan nodded. Maybe. Do you need them? The question caught him off guard, not because it was complicated, because it wasn't. He looked around the small office, the service manuals, the tools, the photographs, the life he had built after losing everything. No, he admitted. Grace smiled. Then, it's easy. It is? You only go if it helps people. Then she returned to her homework as though she hadn't just summarized a decision executives routinely spent months analyzing. That night, Ryan sat alone in the shop long after everyone else left. Outside, snow drifted beneath the streetlights. Inside, he opened a storage cabinet in the back room and pulled out a cardboard archive box, the same box he had carried out of Vance Prestige 3 years earlier. Inside were hundreds of pages of notes, customer complaints, technical bulletins, escalation reports, ideas, solutions, everything he had tried to protect. He spent hours reading through them, not because he missed the company, because he was trying to answer a different question. If he went back, could he actually change it? Or would the company simply use his credibility to repair its image? Shortly after midnight, he found himself staring at a handwritten note he had written years earlier. The paper had yellowed slightly at the edges. The sentence was simple. A good technician fixes cars. A great technician fixes systems. Ryan looked at the note for a long time. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in his pocket. For the first time since Sandra Whitmore had walked into the shop, he thought he knew what his answer might be. Ryan arrived at Vance Prestige headquarters the following Tuesday carrying nothing except a notebook and the folded piece of paper he had placed in his pocket 4 nights earlier. He had not accepted the position. Not yet. Isabella had agreed to his condition before any decision would be made. He wanted access, real access, no presentations, no guided tours, no carefully prepared reports. If he was going to evaluate whether the company could change, he needed to see the company exactly as it was. Isabella met him in the lobby at 7:00 a.m. sharp. You're early, she said. Ryan glanced at his watch. No, I'm on time. That answer made her smile. 3 years earlier, she probably would have found it irritating. Now she found it reassuring. They spent the entire day moving through departments, service operations, warranty processing, technical training, customer relations, audit compliance. Ryan asked questions few executives ever asked. His assistant, Lucas Reed, arrived shortly after 7, 26 years old, hardworking, and still idealistic enough to ask questions when he didn't know an answer. Ryan respected that. Too many mechanics learned how to fake confidence before they learned how to solve problems. In the waiting area near the front window, Ryan's 6-year-old daughter Grace slept curled up beneath a folded shop blanket. School had been canceled because of snow. The neighbor who normally helped was away. Not revenue questions, not growth questions, process questions. Why are technicians paid this way? Why are customer disclosures handled here instead of there? Why does this approval require 3 signatures, while that one requires none? Why is the incentive structure rewarding replacement instead of diagnosis? By late afternoon, Isabella looked exhausted. Ryan looked energized. You enjoy this, she said. Solving problems? Finding them. Ryan nodded. Problems tell the truth. The next morning, he requested access to training records. By lunch, he found another pattern. Over the previous 4 years, diagnostic training hours had steadily decreased while sales performance metrics had increased. Technicians were spending less time learning and more time producing revenue. Nobody had intended for that outcome. It had simply happened. One small policy change at a time, one quarterly target at a time, one bonus structure at a time. Ryan showed the data to Isabella. She stared at the charts for nearly a minute. How did nobody notice this? They did. Who? Probably dozens of people. He pointed. The problem is that everybody noticed different pieces. That afternoon, Ryan visited one of the dealership service centers involved in the audit. Most employees recognized him immediately. Some looked embarrassed. Others looked relieved. A few looked nervous. Near the back of the service department, a young technician named Ethan approached cautiously. "Mr. Cole?" Ryan turned. "Yeah? You probably don't remember me." Ryan studied him briefly. "Apprentice program. 3 years ago." Ethan's eyes widened. "You do remember. You always labeled your wiring diagrams in blue ink." Ethan laughed. "Nobody remembers that. Apparently somebody does." The conversation lasted only 5 minutes, yet afterward, Ethan quietly handed Ryan a flash drive. "There are things on there you should see." Ryan accepted it without comment. Back at headquarters, he reviewed the contents with Isabella and legal counsel. Training records, internal messages, meeting summaries. Nothing dramatic, nothing illegal by itself, but together, they revealed how deeply the culture had shifted. Employees had gradually learned that speed mattered more than accuracy, revenue mattered more than diagnosis, convenience mattered more than truth. The system had not become dishonest overnight. It had become dishonest one compromise at a time. On Friday morning, Ryan met Isabella in the executive conference room overlooking the city. The skyline disappeared behind low winter clouds. The folder containing the employment offer sat in the center of the table exactly where she had left it. Neither touched it immediately. Finally, Isabella spoke. "Well?" Ryan looked out the window for a long moment. "You have good people." "I know. You also have a system that teaches good people bad habits." Isabella nodded slowly. "Can it be fixed?" Ryan thought about Grace, about Lucas, about Ethan, about every technician who had entered the profession because they loved solving problems and then slowly learned that solving problems wasn't always what the system rewarded. "Yes," he said, "but it's going to take years." "That's fine. And it's going to be uncomfortable." "That's fine too." Ryan finally looked at the offer. "Then I have conditions." Isabella smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that." He opened the notebook and slid a handwritten list across the table. Mandatory bulletin disclosure, diagnostic first compensation models, independent technical review panels, ethics training, customer transparency, requirements, technician education funding, protected escalation channels. Dozens of changes. Isabella read every line. When she finished, she didn't negotiate a single one. "Done." Ryan raised an eyebrow. "You didn't even ask how much this will cost." "Because I already know." "And?" Isabella closed the notebook. "Less than another. Jason Mercer." For the first time during the entire meeting, Ryan laughed, really laughed. The decision was made. Not because the title impressed him, not because the salary was attractive, not because the company suddenly deserved him. He accepted because Grace had been right. You only go if it helps people, and for the first time in a very long time, he believed it might. Grace had spent enough time in the shop to understand its rhythm. She rarely complained. Ryan had gently covered her with the blanket before opening the bay doors. Neither he nor Lucas mentioned it. Some realities did not require discussion. The phone rang at 8:17. Margaret introduced herself immediately. Within minutes, she explained the situation. 8 Bentleys, 14 fault codes per vehicle, a $200,000 estimate. Ryan listened without interrupting. When she finished, 1 year later, Ryan Cole stood in the exact same service bay where he had once been escorted out carrying a cardboard box. The difference was that nobody was asking him to leave anymore. The service center looked familiar, but it no longer felt the same. New training stations occupied the rear section of the building. Diagnostic reference boards covered the walls. Technical bulletins were displayed openly instead of buried inside databases few people knew existed. Most importantly, technicians were no longer rewarded for selling the most expensive repair. They were rewarded for finding the correct one. It had taken 12 months, thousands of hours, hundreds of difficult conversations, more resistance than Ryan cared to count. But the system was changing, not perfectly, not quickly, just steadily. Which was usually how real progress worked. At 8:00 that morning, Isabella Vance stepped onto a small stage set up inside the training center. Employees from across multiple locations filled the room. Some had traveled several states to attend. Others joined through live streams. Reporters had been invited too, though Ryan would have preferred they stay home. Isabella adjusted the microphone. 1 year ago, this company faced a difficult truth. The room grew quiet. We discovered that expertise had been ignored, integrity had been discouraged, and some of our best people had been treated as obstacles rather than assets. Her eyes briefly found Ryan in the crowd. Today is not about celebrating a turnaround. It's about recognizing the people who made one possible. Applause followed. Ryan looked mildly uncomfortable. Grace, sitting beside Lucas in the front row, thought the reaction was hilarious. "He hates this part," she whispered. Lucas nodded. "More than oil changes. That's a lot. A lot." Isabella continued speaking. Customer satisfaction scores had reached record levels. Warranty disputes had fallen dramatically. Independent audits showed the highest compliance ratings in company history. Technician retention had improved. Training participation had doubled. The numbers were impressive. Ryan appreciated them. But numbers were not what caught his attention. After the presentation ended, a line of employees formed near the stage. Technicians, advisors, apprentices, managers. One by one, they approached Ryan. Some simply shook his hand. Others thanked him. A few shared stories. One technician explained that he had almost left the industry before the new training program changed his mind. Another described how protected escalation channels allowed him to report a serious issue without fear of retaliation. A third admitted that he had once believed honesty and success were incompatible. He no longer believed that. Ryan listened to all of them. Then, whenever possible, redirected credit somewhere else. Around noon, Ethan approached carrying a binder. The same young technician who had handed over the flash drive months earlier now supervised part of the apprenticeship program. "Thought you might want to see this." Ryan opened the binder. Inside were photographs, students, training classes, certification ceremonies, workshop projects. Hundreds of people. Hundreds of opportunities that had not existed before. On the final page sat a simple statistic. Technical escalations resolved through protected reporting. 417. Ryan stared at the number for several seconds. 417 problems solved because someone felt safe enough to speak. 417 situations that might otherwise have been ignored. That mattered. More than awards, more than titles, more than public recognition, much more. Later that afternoon, after the event concluded, Ryan slipped away before anyone could organize another speech. He picked Grace up from school at exactly 3:02 p.m., just as he always did. Some routines remained non-negotiable. "How was your day?" he asked. Grace climbed into the passenger seat. "Good. Anything exciting?" "I got an A on my science project." "Nice. And Mrs. Patterson says my volcano was the most realistic." Ryan nodded seriously. "That's a very prestigious achievement." "I know." They stopped for hot chocolate on the way home. Grace spent most of the drive explaining volcanic activity in extraordinary detail. Ryan understood maybe half of it. That didn't matter. Listening mattered. As they walked into the apartment that evening, Grace noticed an envelope resting against the front door. No return address, just Ryan's name written neatly across the front. Inside was a handwritten letter. The paper was expensive, the handwriting familiar. Jason Mercer. Ryan read it once, then again. The letter contained no excuses, no attempts to justify anything, no requests for forgiveness. Jason simply acknowledged what he had done. He asked only 2 questions. What exactly were the fault codes, and had the vehicles been driven regularly in cold temperatures after service? Margaret read directly from the estimate. Radar faults, camera faults, emergency braking faults, stability control faults, lane departure system faults. 14 warnings in total. Ryan grew quiet. The silence lasted long enough for Margaret to wonder whether the call had dropped. It hadn't. Ryan was remembering something. 2 years earlier, the choices he had made, the people he had harmed. Near the end, he wrote a single sentence that stayed with Ryan long after he finished reading. "I spent years protecting a system because it benefited me, and never realized the system was destroying me too." Ryan folded the letter carefully and placed it back inside the envelope. Grace looked up from the couch. "Good letter?" Ryan considered the question. Important letter. Are you mad? He thought about that too, then shook his head. No, why not? Ryan sat beside her. Because carrying anger for a year is heavy. Grace nodded as though that made perfect sense. Makes your arms tired. Ryan laughed. Exactly. The following spring, Vance Prestige officially renamed its technical education initiative. Ryan objected immediately when he heard the proposal. Isabella ignored him immediately after hearing the objection. The Ryan Cole Technical Integrity Program opened in April. Ryan lost that argument by unanimous decision. Grace thought it was the funniest thing that had ever happened. 3 years later, the program expanded nationally. 5 years later, other manufacturers adopted similar reporting protections and training standards. 10 years later, nobody remembered the exact dollar amount of the Bentley estimate that started everything. Nobody remembered the board meetings. Nobody remembered the audit reports, but people remembered the lesson. The lesson survived because it was simple. Expertise matters. Integrity matters more. Looking back now, most people think this story is about a $14 fuse. They think it's about a $200,000 estimate, a dishonest executive, or a corporate investigation. Those things were part of the story, but they were never the heart of it. The real story was about a man who refused to stop telling the truth, even after the truth cost him his career. It was about a little girl who kept reminding adults what was actually important. It was about a company learning that culture is built by what leaders tolerate, not by what they promise. Most of all, it was about understanding that small failures, if ignored long enough, eventually become large ones. A $14 fuse nearly created a $200,000 problem. One ignored bulletin became hundreds of damaged customer relationships. One compromised decision became an entire compromised system. Fortunately, the opposite is also true. One honest technician can change a company. One courageous decision can change a culture. One small act of integrity can travel farther than anyone expects. In the end, the fuse was replaced. The system was repaired. The company recovered. But the greatest repair was something no diagnostic scanner could ever measure: trust. And once that came back, everything else finally started working too. The end. While working at Vance Prestige Auto Group, he had investigated a nearly identical issue involving Bentayga models operating in cold weather. During that investigation, he discovered a Bentley technical bulletin, TB42 042 399. The bulletin described a failure pattern involving a component called Fuse F47, a tiny $14 thermal fuse hidden beneath the rear cargo floor. Under cold climate operating conditions, the fuse could develop internal resistance as temperatures increased.